On November 10, 1975, a violent storm was raging over the Great Lakes. On Lake Superior, several ships were fighting their way through hurricane-force winds and monstrous waves. The freighter Arthur M. Anderson was one of them. The previous day, she had departed Two Harbors, Minnesota with a load of iron ore bound for Gary, Indiana. The weather was calm when she left, but only a few hours later, the storm began to churn up Lake Superior. Ever since leaving port, the Anderson had been following another lake freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Both ships continued fighting their way through the storm for the next several hours, as they struggled to make it to the shelter of Whitefish Bay. But little did the crew of the Anderson know, the Edmund Fitzgerald would never make it to Whitefish Bay. She was found several days later, broken in two at the bottom of the lake, and her loss remains a mystery to this day. The Great Lakes are the inland seas of North America. They have a surface area of almost 95,000 square miles, and they hold roughly 20% of the Earth's fresh water, with the largest one, Lake Superior, holding about 13% of the world's fresh water, more than the other four Great Lakes combined. They, along with the St. Lawrence Seaway, are the busiest inland waterway in North America and are vital for commerce in both the US and Canada. However, the Great Lakes also have a deadly reputation, as thousands of ships have met their end in these frigid waters, many of them going down due to fierce storms that ravaged the lakes in the fall and winter, most notably being the White Hurricane of 1913 and the Armistice Day Storm of 1940. But over the years, as technology progressed, major shipwrecks on the Great Lakes were thought of as a thing of the past, as ships became larger and more advanced. However, deadly storms still continued to claim countless ships and mariners, and many captains were under enormous pressure to transport as much cargo as possible before the end of the season, or risk putting their entire career in jeopardy. But by the 1950s, shipping technology had improved significantly, and many companies were confident that their ships could weather any storm the lakes threw at them. And this is where the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald begins. In the 1950s, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, based in Milwaukee, invested heavily in the natural resources of the Great Lakes region, which called for the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald. They contracted the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in River Rouge, Michigan, to construct the vessel. The ship was designed to be the largest vessel on the Great Lakes, while still being able to pass through the locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway, which at the time was under construction and nearing completion. Labeled hull number 301, her keel was laid down on August 8, 1957, and by June 1958, her hull was completed and ready for launch. When the ship was launched on June 7, 1958, more than 10,000 people came from all over the area to see the new ship take to the water for the first time, and a large flotilla of boats sat in the river outside the shipyard to watch the launch. She was to be named the Edmund Fitzgerald after the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, and she was christened by his wife, Elizabeth Fitzgerald. However, the launch didn't go exactly to plan. When Mrs. Fitzgerald attempted to christen the ship, it took 3 attempts to break the bottle of champagne on her hull, and then, when the shipyard workers tried to release the support struts holding the ship up, the ship didn't move. It took more than a half an hour before the supports were released. Then it happened. Her hull slid down the slipway and into the water. The impact created a massive wave which crashed over the dock and soaked some of the spectators in the crowd, and the ship continued to glide across the water before bumping into the other side of the basin. A Toledo man in the crowd by the name of Jennings B. Frazier was so shocked by the impact that he suffered a heart attack and died shortly thereafter. After her launch, the Fitzgerald was then brought into a dry dock, where she was fitted out for the next few months. At the time, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest vessel on the Great Lakes, earning her the unofficial title Queen of the Lakes, coming in at 13,632 gross tons and measuring 729 feet or 222 meters in length, easily surpassing the previous Queen of the Lakes, the freighter Cliff's Victory. And the Edmund Fitzgerald held the title for the next year, being surpassed by the freighter Murray Bay in September of 1959. The Fitzgerald was powered by a coal-fired Westinghouse steam turbine engine which drove a single 20-foot propeller for a top speed of 14 knots, and could generate up to 7,500 shaft horsepower. She had 21 cargo hatches that led into 3 large cargo holds that were each separated by a thick screen, with ballast tanks on the outside. Screens that separated the holds were not watertight, so really the ship only had one compartment. On older lake freighters, the crew would have to walk across the spar deck to get to the other side of the vessel, which is a dangerous place to be in rough weather. However, the Fitzgerald did have tunnels that ran the length of the ship. Her design remained similar to the blueprints that built nearly every lake freighter since the 19th century. She had a superstructure at the bow of the ship which housed the bridge, and a second superstructure at the stern which housed the crew quarters, galley, and her funnel, and the space between them was the cargo holds. So although she was modern and state-of-the-art for the time, her design remained similar to other lake freighters built decades earlier. The ship was fully completed in September of 1958, and she entered service on September 22nd. The Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company had actually commissioned the Edmund Fitzgerald to be chartered out to different companies, so the Ogle Bay Norton Corporation based in Cleveland had signed a 25-year contract to operate the vessel. After completing her sea trials, the Fitzgerald, under the command of Captain Bert Lampert, departed River Rouge bound for Silver Bay, Minnesota, where she would pick up a load of iron ore. When she reached the Sioux Locks, crowds gathered to watch the new freighter pass through on her way to Lake Superior. She then arrived in Silver Bay on September 24th, where she took on a cargo of 20,000 tons of iron ore. She then departed with her cargo bound for Toledo, Ohio, where it would be delivered to the Armagost Steel Company, and when she passed through the Sioux Locks on her maiden return voyage, she broke the record for the most cargo carried through the locks by a single ship. She then arrived in Toledo, Ohio, where she was unloaded and her cargo of iron ore was delivered to the Armagost Steel Company. She continued sailing until the end of the season, where she was laid up for the winter. At the start of the 1959 season, the Fitzgerald had a new master, Captain Newman Larson, and he remained in command of the vessel until 1966, when he was replaced by Captain Peter Pulser, and he remained the skipper until 1972, when Captain Ernest McSorley took command of the vessel, and he would be the Fitzgerald's captain for the rest of her career. A few months after the Fitzgerald entered service, another ship following very similar designs was being constructed. Laid down on March 18, 1959, at the same shipyard that built the Fitzgerald, Great Lakes Engineering Work for the Bethlehem Transportation Company, the design of the new ship was nearly identical to that of the Edmund Fitzgerald. She was named the Arthur B. Homer, and was launched on November 7, 1959, and unfortunately would be the last ship built by Great Lakes Engineering Work. The Arthur B. Homer entered service on April 20, 1960, and she remained in service until 1980. Both ships, although owned by separate companies, were considered by many to be sister ships, and both would have very successful careers. However, the Fitzgerald did have a few minor accidents over the course of her career. In 1969, she ran aground in the St. Mary's River, and in April 1970, she collided with the freighter Hochelaga. Later that year, she rammed one of the lock walls in the Sioux, and the same thing happened in 1973 and 1974. And on January 7, 1974, she lost one of her anchors in the Detroit River. And on May 20, 1992, it was found and recovered by divers. It is now on display in Belle Island State Park in Detroit. But these incidents were easily fixed and didn't pose a concern for the ship's owners. And the freighter continued to be an icon of the Great Lakes. In fact, while he was in command of the Fitzgerald, Captain Peter Pulser would get on the ship's loudspeakers to play music and tell her history as she passed through the Sioux Locks, and this gave him the nickname the DJ Captain. Then in 1964, she became the first ship to transport more than 1 million tons of iron ore through the Sioux Locks in a single season. She then bested that record in 1968 by carrying 1.2 million tons of iron ore through the Sioux that season. And in 1969, she set a new record for the most cargo transported by a freighter in a single voyage, at 27,402 tons of cargo. And that same year, a thruster was installed in the ship's bow, which allowed her to maneuver herself more easily in port without the need of tugs. Then, in 1971, the Fitzgerald underwent an overhaul where her boilers were converted from coal burning to oil burning. By 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was still a favorite on the Great Lakes, and at only 17 years of age, many believed she would sail the Great Lakes for many years to come. In the early morning hours of November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald, under the command of Captain Ernest McSorley, was docked at the Burlington Northern Railroad Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin, preparing for her final voyage of the season. Over the next several hours, she took on a cargo of 26,116 tons of iron ore, which was bound for the Zug Island Steel Mill in Detroit. After delivering her cargo, she was scheduled to head to Toledo, Ohio, where she would be laid up for the winter. But little did her crew know that several hundred miles away, a storm was brewing in Kansas and Oklahoma, and was rapidly moving north toward the Great Lakes. The National Weather Service predicted that the storm would pass east of the Great Lakes and would be no concern. The weather forecast even forecasted the system as a, quote, typical November storm, but the storm would prove to be much stronger than initially thought. At 2:15 p.m. on the afternoon of November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was fully loaded with her cargo of iron ore, and she pulled away from the dock and out into Lake Superior. She had 29 men on board when she left, and little did anyone know that this would be the last time any of them would be seen alive again. When the Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin on the afternoon of November 9th, the weather was calm for that time of year, and it seemed to her crew that she would easily be able to finish out the season. Around 2 hours after the Fitzgerald left Superior, another vessel had left port with a cargo of iron ore. This was the freighter Arthur M. Anderson. Labeled hull number 868, the Anderson was built in 1952 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a division of the United States Steel Corporation. She was launched on February 16, 1952, and she entered service on August 10th. Originally, she measured 647 feet or 197 meters in length, and came in at 11,623 gross tons. Her hull was lengthened earlier in 1975 and she was remeasured to 767 feet, or 234 meters in length, and she now came in at 13,796 gross tons, making her slightly larger than the Edmund Fitzgerald. And around 2 hours after the Fitzgerald had cleared Superior, Wisconsin, the Anderson had left Two Harbors, Minnesota with a cargo of iron ore bound for Gary, Indiana, meaning both ships would follow the same route for most of their voyage. On this voyage, the Anderson was under the command of Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper. Not long after departing, the crew on the bridge of the Anderson could see the Edmund Fitzgerald about 15 miles ahead. Shortly thereafter, at 7 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a gale warning for Lake Superior. Soon, Captain Cooper of the Anderson established radio contact with Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald. The storm intensified over the course of the night, with storm-force winds of up to 52 knots and wave heights of up to 10 feet. At roughly 2 a.m. on the morning of November 10th, both ships decided to change course by sailing closer to the Canadian side of Lake Superior, which, although a longer route, would give them some shelter from the storm. By dawn, the storm had lulled, but the Weather Service knew it was going to pick back up, and soon they escalated their warnings from gale to storm. And at 3 p.m., the winds intensified from 5 knots to 45 knots, creating massive waves that pounded the freighters with relentless force. And soon, snow squalls descended over Lake Superior, reducing visibility significantly. So much, in fact, that the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared from the view of the Arthur M. Anderson, and this would be the last time the Fitzgerald would be seen on the surface. Both ships were headed for Whitefish Bay on the southeastern end of Lake Superior to take shelter, but the storm was still pretty bad, and both ships remained several miles apart from each other. Soon the Edmund Fitzgerald was passing by Caribou Island, an island notorious for its 6-fathom shoals and other navigational hazards that lie just off the coast. Captain Cooper watched his radar, and noticed that the Fitzgerald was passing dangerously close to Caribou Island. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley called Cooper and reported to Cooper, quote, "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a starboard list. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?" Unquote. McSorley then told Cooper that he had his pumps running, and they were able to keep pace with the flooding. However, it was quite unusual when McSorley said that his fence rails and vents were damaged, as it would have taken more than a wave to damage them. Some believed that as she passed over the shoals near Caribou Island, she might have sustained hogging stress on her hull, which would have flexed the ship enough to bend the rails. Others theorized that there might have been a large, heavy object adrift in the lake that smashed into the ship and taken down the fence rails and vent cover. But in the end, no one knows. And still, the crews of both ships did not seem very concerned, and both were making good progress through the storm. As dusk fell, the storm intensified, and the Coast Guard warned all ships on Lake Superior to get out of the storm and into safe harbor. The Sioux locks were also closed due to the weather, and both the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were desperately trying to get to the shelter of Whitefish Bay. That evening, the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson were now 17 miles apart, fighting their way through massive waves that battered the freighters with relentless force, and winds of up to 96 miles per hour, the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane. Unfortunately, around the same time, the Fitzgerald's radar system went down. She was now sailing blind through one of the worst storms to ever hit the Great Lakes. With little other options, her crew searched for the beacon of the Whitefish Point Lighthouse, as well as the radio beacon at the station. But little did they know, the power in the area went out due to the weather, and even with the power switched over to the emergency system, it was out of range for the Edmund Fitzgerald. So at this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald had no way to figure out where she was. Captain McSorley called Captain Cooper and told him, quote, "I have lost both radars. Can you provide me with radar plots until we reach Whitefish?" Unquote. The Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, agreed. And now, the Fitzgerald would rely on the Anderson's radar to reach Whitefish Bay. Just after 5 p.m., Captain McSorley received a call from Captain Cedric Woodward of the Swedish vessel Avafors, telling him that the Whitefish Point Lighthouse beacon was back on, but it was still out of range for the Edmund Fitzgerald. And just then, the crew on the bridge of the Avafors overheard McSorley telling the crew not to go on deck, as well as the other crew members shouting. Not long after, Captain McSorley called the Avafors again, telling them that his ship had a severe list to starboard, his radars were lost, and the waves constantly broke over the deck. McSorley told the crew of the Avafors that it was the worst storm he had ever been in his 43 years on the lakes. The Arthur M. Anderson, 15 miles behind the Fitzgerald, was battling the exact same conditions. At this point, the Fitzgerald was only 35 miles away from the entrance to Whitefish Bay. It seemed that both ships would be able to make it to shelter. By 6 p.m., the storm had intensified once again, with 25-foot waves that repeatedly crashed over their decks, putting enormous strain on their hulls. As if things couldn't get any worse, at 6:30 p.m., the crew on the bridge of the Anderson stood in horror as a 35 to 40-foot rogue wave bore down on the stern of their ship. It slammed into the aft deckhouse, completely submerging it for a few moments as it raced across the spar deck before smashing into the pilot house. For a moment, the bow was completely buried by this wave. And then, another rogue wave, the same height as the first one, smashed into the ship once again, submerging the ship for a few moments before she resurfaced. Captain Cooper estimated those waves were about 35 to 40 feet tall, and if he was correct, then they would be taller than the highest recorded waves on Lake Superior. And Cooper feared that those same waves were headed towards the Fitzgerald. By 7 p.m., the storm persisted, but in about an hour or so, both ships would be in Whitefish Bay. Around the same time, the Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, told McSorley that another ship was passing by his ship in the opposite direction. McSorley asked if he needed to change course, but Clark told him that it wasn't necessary. At 7:10, just before ending the call, Clark asked McSorley, quote, "How are you making out with your problems?" And McSorley responded, "We are holding our own, going along like an old shoe." That was the last message ever heard from the Fitzgerald. Captain Cooper had returned to the wheelhouse right after the call had ended. He checked the radar and noticed that the Fitzgerald was only about 10 miles ahead. Just then, the weather started to improve, and the visibility increased. It was then that the crew on the bridge of the Anderson saw the beacon from the Whitefish Point lighthouse in the distance, as well as the lights of several ships anchored in Whitefish Bay. However, since they could see the Whitefish Point lighthouse beacon as well as the lights of ships in Whitefish Bay, they should be able to see the lights of the Fitzgerald there as well, but there was nothing there. Captain Cooper thought that the Fitzgerald might have suffered a power failure, so he asked the crew on the bridge to keep an eye out for the ship's silhouette, but they never saw it. One crew member on the bridge claimed to have seen a light in the distance, but Captain Cooper and First Mate Morgan Clark didn't see it. The crew checked the radar, but the area where the Fitzgerald should have been on radar was empty. They tried to contact the Fitzgerald by radio, but they received no response. Cooper then contacted a few nearby vessels to see if they had seen or heard from the Fitzgerald, but they didn't either. The Edmund Fitzgerald had simply disappeared, with no distress call or mayday. Captain Cooper called the Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie, but the Coast Guard was focused on searching for a 16-foot pleasure craft, and they told the Anderson to keep an eye out for it. At 8:25 p.m., Captain Cooper called the Coast Guard once again, and this time they listened to his concerns.
The last time that you talked to him, at what time that was, Louis? I had to check with the mate on it, but it must have been right around 7:15, our time, Eastern Standard Time. This is good, Roger. So also, did you come about or alter your course any way to look for him, over? Negative. I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not. 3 hooks were right up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. This is Group 2, and just for confirmation, sir, he couldn't see any lights pick him up on radar either, is that correct? No, I don't know. I thought we were picking him up on radar when I come up in the wheelhouse and talked to the mate. The sea return is real bad, but we thought we had the target. But I don't know. Now I wonder.
At 8:45 p.m., the Arthur M. Anderson arrived safely in Whitefish Bay, safe from the worst of the storm, and she remained there for some time. The Coast Guard had little in the area that could survive the storm. The 180-foot Coast Guard buoy tender Woodrush had left Duluth bound for the wreck site, but it would take several hours for her to arrive. They also had aircraft available in the area, but it would be difficult for them to take off due to the weather. The Coast Guard then asked the Anderson to head back out into the storm and search for any trace of the ship or her crew.
Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way.
Cooper was hesitant to go back and search, but he thought that if it were his ship that were lost, the Edmund Fitzgerald would have gone back and searched for them. Shortly after, the Coast Guard asked other ships in Whitefish Bay to join the search as well, and only one ship agreed to join the search, the freighter William Clay Ford, under the command of Captain Don Erickson. After several hours of searching, the Arthur M. Anderson and the William Clay Ford found no trace of the Fitzgerald's crew. All they found was a debris field. By the next morning, November 11th, the storm had passed, and several other vessels had joined the search, such as the Frontenac, the Wilfred Sykes, Roger Blau, and several others. None of them found any survivors. But then, around 8 a.m., the crew on the Arthur M. Anderson found something shocking. It was half of one of the Fitzgerald's lifeboats, floating upside down. Captain Cooper claimed that it looked like a massive hand tore it in half, and later that day, the SS American Mariner came across the other half of the lifeboat. The Fitzgerald's other lifeboat was found that same day on the shore of Coppermine Point, Ontario by the local police. This lifeboat was also heavily damaged, but they had no trace of survivors in them, and it was quickly determined that they were not launched, but broke free from the ship when she sank. Around the same time, the Anderson also came across some of the Fitzgerald's life preservers and life jackets, and then they came across a massive oil slick near where she went down. And over the next few days, debris washed ashore on both sides of the lake. Then, on November 14th, a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion aircraft was flying over the Canadian side of the lake, about 17 miles from Whitefish Bay, only a few hundred feet from the U.S.-Canadian border, when it detected a strong contact using a magnetic anomaly detector. The Coast Guard cutter Woodrush came on scene and used side-scan sonar to survey it, to which they found 2 pieces of wreckage in about 530 feet of water. The wreck was scanned 2 more times. In the spring of 1976, an ROV was sent down to document the wreck, and it was confirmed that it was the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. She lies broken in two with both sections sitting 170 feet away from one another. The bow section sits upright on the bottom, while the stern section lies upside down and rotated about 130 degrees from the bow, and the lake bed surrounding the wreck is covered in iron ore that spilled out of her holds when she sank. Over the next few decades, numerous expeditions to the wreck would lead to countless theories as to how she sank. When the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was located, she was found to have broken in two, which led to many theories on how she went down. After all, she wasn't the first ship to sink on the Great Lakes after breaking up. 9 years earlier, in 1966, the freighter Daniel J. Morrell was caught in a fierce November gale on Lake Huron when she broke apart and sank in roughly 8 minutes. Out of the 29 crew on board the Morrell, only one survived, Watchman Dennis Hale. And 8 years before then, in 1958, only 2 months after the Fitzgerald entered service, the freighter Karl D. Bradley was caught in a violent storm on Lake Michigan when she broke apart and sank. Out of the 35 crew on board, only 2 survived, Watchman Frank Mays and First Mate Elmer Fleming. Both the Morella and the Bradley broke apart on the surface when they sank, but they were much older than the Fitzgerald when they sank. Bradley was 31 years old when she sank, and the Daniel J. Morrell was 60 years old when she sank. As a result, it's difficult to compare their losses with the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and unlike with the Morrell and the Bradley, there were no survivors from the Fitzgerald. Some theorize that she nosedived to the bottom of the lake, and when she struck the bottom, she broke apart, and both sections separated from one another and sank. Others believe that she broke apart on the surface like the Morrell and the Bradley. It's also heavily debated on what caused the ship to take on water in the first place. Just before the Anderson lost radar contact with the Fitzgerald, the Anderson was struck by 2 massive rogue waves from the stern. Lake Superior has this phenomenon known as the Three Sisters, which are 3 rogue waves that come right after one another. The Anderson likely experienced this phenomenon when she encountered those 2 rogue waves, and the third one might have missed the ship. After those waves struck his ship, Captain Cooper feared that those waves were heading in the direction of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Another theory is that she struck the shoals that lay just off Caribou Island. Captain Cooper supports both of these theories because he saw on his radar that the Fitzgerald passed right over the shallows of Caribou Island, and right after that happened, Captain McSorley called Cooper and told him that he had taken a starboard list and lost his fence railings. But in my opinion, it was very likely a combination of several factors that doomed the Fitzgerald, as it is with nearly all shipwrecks. There are a lot more theories out there on how she sank, but we will not be going into them, and we will probably never know exactly how she took on water and how she broke apart, as there is not enough evidence out there to prove or disprove any theories. The morning after the disaster, at the Mariners' Church in Detroit, Father Richard Ingalls held a prayer service for the men lost on the Edmund Fitzgerald, ringing the bell 29 times, once for each crew member. And this became a tradition for the Mariners' Church, which they still do to this day. Finally, in July 1977, the Coast Guard released its report on the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But this report ended up being quite controversial, as it states that the Fitzgerald's hatch covers were not properly secured, and blamed the crew for laziness, and later dives to the wreck would prove that the hatches were properly secured. The Fitzgerald story continued to gain attention by the media and general public, and in August 1976, Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot released a song called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which became one of the most successful songs of his career, and is one of the reasons the Edmund Fitzgerald is as famous as it is. He passed away on May 1st, 2023, at the age of 84. And when the Detroit Mariners' Church rang the bell 29 times for the crew of the Fitzgerald, they rang the bell a 30th time in his honor. At the time of the disaster, Edmund Fitzgerald, the person in which the freighter was named after, was still alive, and he was shocked by the news. He retired around the same time, and he attended the memorial service for the victims. He passed away in 1986 at the age of 90. Over the years, with the ongoing dives to the wreck, the families of the victims believed that the wreck should be declared a burial site, off limits to divers, and in 1994, they began a campaign to do so. The last expedition to the wreck took place in July 1995, which sought to recover the bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The original bell was recovered, and it was replaced with one that was engraved with the names of all 29 men who lost their lives on the Fitzgerald. The bell broke the surface of Lake Superior on July 4th, 1995, and is now on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point, Michigan, only 17 miles from where the Fitzgerald had gone down. Although the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is now off limits to diving, pieces of the ship do survive today, such as the aforementioned bell recovered in 1995, and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum also has some other artifacts from the Fitzgerald. The Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Bell Island in Detroit has the anchor of the Fitzgerald, lost in 1974, which was recovered in 1992, and is now on display just outside the museum. Also on Bell Island is the pilot house of the William Clay Ford, the freighter that joined the Anderson for the search of the Edmund Fitzgerald. When the ship was scrapped in 1987, her pilot house was recovered and put on display in Bell Island. The SS Valley Camp museum ship in Sault Ste. Marie has both lifeboats of the Fitzgerald recovered the day after she was lost, as well as other smaller artifacts located in various museums around the Great Lakes. Also, the Arthur M. Anderson, the ship in communication with the Fitzgerald on the night she sank, is still with us today. though she has since been upgraded, and since early 2025, she has been in an extended layup in Toledo, Ohio. And as of the making of this video, no one knows when or if she will return to service, but up until her extended layup, she always saluted the Edmund Fitzgerald on the anniversary of the disaster. To this day, the Edmund Fitzgerald is the largest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and also the most recent shipwreck on the Great Lakes. It's because of the changes made to Great Lakes regulations after the Fitzgerald disaster that there has not been a shipwreck on the Great Lakes since. Before the Fitzgerald disaster, Great Lakes captains were under enormous pressure to deliver the most cargo on time and before the end of the season. The companies that owned the ships had profits as their #1 priorities, even over safety, which meant that even if a deadly storm was coming, they were required to deliver as much cargo on time and as late into the season as possible, or risk losing their careers. Nowadays, when there are ships in ports on the Great Lakes preparing to depart, and a storm is on its way, especially if the weather service underestimates the force of the storm, no ships are leaving port. But if they are, and they're already out on the lakes, they hug the shore, or seek shelter in a safe harbor. It's because of these recommendations that there has not been a single shipwreck on the Great Lakes since the Edmund Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, as it is with many disasters, whether it be a maritime disaster or not, it almost always takes a disaster for people to learn and for regulations to be put in place. It's estimated that there are between 6,000 and 10,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, dating back to the 17th century, and the Fitzgerald is the largest, most recent, and most famous shipwreck of them all. 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald disaster, and perhaps if she didn't sink on that fierce November night, she might have still been with us to this day. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any new uploads from this channel. Anyways, thanks for watching. We all wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.